Welcome back, Year 13s. I hope you and your families are keeping well. Today we'll be continuing with the making of modern India and our sort of gathering of the chronology of the events across the 100-year period. And today we'll be focusing on the 20-year period from the beginning of the 20th century, so from 1900 all the way to 1920. One quick clarification that I wanted to make was that it's really, really important. It's essential for you to be reading the narrative account that I've put up for you, as well as the timeline as we're going along and as we're covering each of these events. Primarily because of the fact that I could perhaps spend a couple of hours lecturing you or talking to you about some of these key events, such as, for example, the Amritsar massacre of 1919. But quite frankly, we don't really have that much time, and it wouldn't be feasible for you guys to be sitting there for that length of time, and it wouldn't be feasible for me either. So as we're going through each of the different events, okay, such as the Partition of Bengal in 1905, the similar deportation in 1906, and the making of the Muslim League, the establishment of the Muslim League in 1906, is important for you to ensure that you're using the narrative and you're using the timeline to establish those facts, to establish that sort of background knowledge for yourselves before delving into the analysis that I'm providing you with as we're going through each of these key events. I just wanted to touch upon the Indian social renaissance again at the end of the 19th century, primarily because of the fact that my last video got cut off a little bit. I'll talk to you about the Arya Samaj in 1875 that was established, which mobilized around Hindu sort of religious and cultural symbols such as the sacredness of the cow, the prioritization of the Hindi language, and then the fact that the Aligarh movement was also established in 1875. And these movements were firstly to build distinctive religious identities for each of the different religions, but also then to combat the challenges that British modernization and westernization brought. Okay. Similarly, you've got for the Sikhs the establishment of the Singh Sabha movement. So in 1873, you've got the establishment of the Amritsar Singh Sabha movement, and 6 years later, in 1879, you've got the establishment of the Lahore Singh Sabha movement, which really mobilizes Sikhs around sort of the traditional Khalsa principles and the learning of Gurmukhi, so that's the Punjabi script, and also then going back to sort of prioritizing the sort of traditional elements of a Sikh identity, so that the 5Ks in particular. So in essence, all of these movements which developed in the late 19th century as part of the Indian social renaissance, they're combating the challenges that British modernization and westernization have brought, but they're also attempting to build their own religious sort of identity so that they can assert their own political rights, okay? So that they're not lost in this era of cultural imperialism. Right, moving on. In 1905, we see the beginnings of the British divide and rule policy being implemented, okay? And this is the first instance of the actions of the Raj really attempting to divide religious communities within India, okay? And this takes place at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s. So what we have is the partition of Bengal, okay? So the Bengal is partitioned into his Hindu and Muslim majority areas. So you've got Eastern Bengal and Assam, which is a Muslim majority area, and then you've got Western Bengal, which is a Hindu majority area. Now, the viceroy at this time was Curzon, okay? And the viceroy is basically the governor general of India, okay? They head the central government of India. They're responsible for the country's administration, and they're the sort of representative of the British crown, okay? So they're the sort of highest sort of ranking sort of British representative within British India at the time, okay? And obviously the viceroys, there's a lot of changeover in viceroys across that period from 1858 onwards. So the partition of Bengal into these majority sort of, well, Muslim majority and Hindu majority areas was supposedly, from the British perspective and from Curzon's perspective, for administrative reasons, for administrative purposes, okay? But it was rather an attempt to introduce communalism to minimize the threat of a united Bengal, okay? So, in essence, what the British wanted to do is that they wanted to divide Bengal um, into religious majority areas because they felt that united Bengal was a massive sort of threat, as there was a growing sort of sense of national consciousness amongst Hindus and Muslims in Bengal who were quite united to drive the British out. Um, Initially, Muslims opposed this partition, but as they began to feel the consequences of the partition, they felt that their interests and their rights were better protected under this sort of Muslim majority area of eastern Bengal and Assam. So obviously the Muslims were satisfied with this, as they feared Hindu domination and sought stronger representation of their own interests. But there was huge opposition from the Hindus, as they did not welcome this separation at all. Primarily because of the fact that we've got Congress, which was established in 1885, which claims to sort of represent all sections of Indian society, irrespective of religion, irrespective of caste, and irrespective of sort of different class boundaries. So this was an attempt to introduce communalism into Bengal to minimize the threat of growing nationalist movements or anti-colonial nationalism within Bengal itself. But the extent to which this worked was sort of quite limited in a sense in the British, in sort of a British from a British perspective, because instead of completely dividing and weakening the Bengalis, it further united them through an anti-partition agitation. Okay, so there was an aroused sort of nationalist feeling amongst those in Bengal, despite the partition, and this sort of aroused nationalist feeling, it sort of led to the establishment of a Bengali identity which cut across narrow interest groups, class, as well as regional barriers, as well as religion as well. So the sort of anti-colonial nationalism in Bengal at the time, despite the partition, okay, it was able to transcend religious boundaries. It was able to transcend narrow interest groups, as well as sort of class as well. So the British weren't able to really permeate this communalism within Bengal as strongly as they wished, because there was still an element of Bengalis united irrespective of religion, and they were able to rebel against the British. They were still united to drive the British out. As the partition of Bengal was an incredibly unpopular policy, it was actually reversed in 1911. Okay, so you see the reunification of Bengal in 1911. Right, we've then got the establishment of the All India Muslim League in December 1906. Okay, so the establishment of the All India Muslim League in 1906 is, by some historians argued and some commentators argued, as a byproduct of the Aligarh movement in the late 19th century. Okay, and the sort of aims and objectives of the Muslim League, which is obviously a political party as well, is to safeguard the political rights and the interests of Muslims, to preach loyalty to the British, and to further the cause of intercommunal amity. Okay, so they're not looking, okay, to completely separate themselves from other religious communities at the time. Okay, they're looking to sort of build friendships, to build relations with other religious communities. So, for example, building relations with the Hindus in Congress primarily, and also, for example, the Akalis and the Sikhs at the time. So whilst the Muslim League is established in 1906, a lot of historians argue that it was the beginning of Muslim separatism. Okay, it was the beginning of the quest for Muslim elites to seek Muslim political rights, um, and to really further their own cause for a separate a separate state. But this did not materialize this early, okay. And the Muslim League was quite committed to establishing good relations with other religious communities and other sort of organizations that were up against them. Again, you can find more about this in the narrative and in the timeline. So make sure you relate back to that. The similar deputation actually occurs in October 1906, on the 1st of October 1906, before the establishment of the Muslim League in December 1906. So the similar deputation was essentially where 70 Muslim leaders, they went to Viceroy Minto, and they presented this deputation, this plan of separate electorates. What separate electorates means is that people in a specific constituency, they vote for their co-religionists, okay, which means that, for example, if we take Punjab, for example, Hindus in Punjab, so citizens following the Hindu religion in Punjab, they would vote for Hindu candidates only. So they would be picking amongst a selection of Hindu candidates, and they would be electing one of those Hindu candidates to represent them. Similarly, Muslim citizens in Punjab would be electing from a selection of Muslim candidates at the time. Okay, so separate electorates essentially means that Hindus are voting for Hindus, Hindu citizens are voting for Hindu candidates, and Muslim citizens in the area are voting for Muslim candidates. Okay, and that is what they proposed. That is what they planned, and this is what they felt was necessary. This is what Muslims felt was necessary in India at the time, being a minority religion, to sort of safeguard their own political rights and their interests. Okay. So the deputation stressed that the Muslim community should be judged by its loyalty to the Raj, not by its numerical strength. Okay, so their loyalty to the British Raj should be taken into account, not the fact that it was a sort of minority religious community within India. So this deputation then, it leads to the Indian Councils Act, okay, the Morley-Minto reforms in 1909. And these reforms essentially establish separate electorates for Hindus and Muslims, okay? So it really paves the way for distinctive politico-religious identities to be built. So at the end of the 19th century, we've got distinctive religious identities being built, okay? But now, in 1909, this sort of transforms into the establishment of politico-religious identities as a result of the British Raj introducing constitutional reforms, democratic reforms. So this links to democratization. It actually fuels communalism, as it makes those religious communities think that only their co-religionists can sort of sufficiently and effectively represent them. Okay, so obviously the Muslim League then, it becomes the chief sort of organization which represents the Muslim people within India. Okay, again, the narrative has a lot more to say about the Morley-Minto reforms. Okay, moving on to the First World War. Now, the First World War is a pivotal event in the sense that Indian soldiers were incredibly loyal throughout the war. Okay, a lot of them signed up to serve in the Indian Army, and a lot of them died fighting in the war. it also had many social and economic consequences for India as a country itself, in terms of unemployment, the fact that they had to pay higher taxes, and the fact that there were crop failures back in India, and as a result of that, famines in many different regions. Okay, India had also contributed a massive sort of sum of money to help Britain in its war effort. And as a result of these immense sacrifices, as a result of this sort of undying loyalty to the British throughout the First World War, um, the Indians make a real case for some concessions being provided to the Indians themselves, which allows them to have more control over their own affairs, to have a greater say in the governance of their own affairs. So, what the Indians are demanding now, what the Indian nationalists are demanding now, is greater say in their own governance. Okay, they want reforms and concessions which lead to self government and home rule. Um, and this is a similar trend which can be noticed amongst many of the countries under the British Empire at the time. It goes for the same with Australia and New Zealand, who were incredibly loyal to the British at the time of the First World War, and who also demanded concessions in the form of greater independence and greater autonomy over their own affairs. Um, so it's a wider trend amongst the British colonies at this time. Okay, the Lucknow Pact. Now, initially, the Morley Minto reforms weren't welcomed by the Hindus, and this was primarily because of the fact that it instilled divisions. Okay, again, Congress were not impressed because they claimed to represent all sections of Indian society. Okay, they did not believe that the Muslims needed separate electorates to ensure that the Muslim community in India could felt um, represented. But the Lucknow Pact in 1916 was an agreement between the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, where the Muslims were given a fixed amount of seats in the Indian Parliament. Okay, so this signified unity between Muslims and Hindus. Okay, um, again, the Lucknow Pact is limited in the sense that it was only a short-term agreement. Relations soon turned sour in the 1920s, as we'll explore next week. This also prompts Congress to become a more extreme organization, a more radical organization, because it was filled with sort of moderates to begin with, um, and a lot of a lot of a lot of people in India, a lot of the extremists, a lot of the radicals in India, they see this as an incredibly sort of a liberal policy towards the Muslims, and they don't see it as acceptable. So um, Tilak rejoins Congress, and he's one of the sort of radicals, the radical nationalists, the extremist nationalists. He rejoins Congress so that it can take a more sort of radical turn in the future, a more sort of rather than a more inclusive approach. They become more sort of alienating of other sort of religious communities and their interests. Um, so the Lucknow Pact was a short-term sign of amity, a short-term sign of agreement between the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress. Right, the Montagu Declaration in 1917 was then as a result of the immense sacrifices that the Indians made during the First World War. Okay, they believed that the British believed then that the Indians needed to be rewarded for the immense sacrifices they made in the First World War, and this was done primarily through a speech that Montagu made. And this declaration, it promised the gradual development of self-government Um, so that means the Indians would soon be able to, under the context of the British Raj, um, become more able to rule themselves. Okay, they would be able to have a greater say in self-government and the governance of their own affairs. So this was a sort of declaration, a sort of speech which promised the development of self-government. It promised Indians that they would have a greater say in their own affairs going forwards. Um, so the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, then in 1919, is the response to the loyalty conveyed by the Indians in the First World War, and it's basically just an extension of the Morley-Minto reforms, and it provides Indians with self-government on a provincial level, which means that essentially on those sort of local government, on those provincial levels, they're able to sort of take control over their own affairs. So, for example, on perhaps like education or health or things like transport, but many of the reserved powers remain for the British. So control over defence, control over communications, control over foreign affairs, of course, control over tax, and control over law and order, for example. Okay, so the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, they established something called diarchy. Okay, power being unequally distributed between the Indian provinces and the British. Um, Again, the narrative goes into this in a lot more depth. Right, the Rowlatt Acts in 1919. Now, these were an oppressive. This was sort of an oppressive um, sentiment from the British. Okay, the British pushed the Rowlatt Acts through the Imperial Legislative Council, and these acts were implemented in areas such as Bengal, Punjab, and Bombay, which presented sort of opposition towards the limited nature of the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, because they wanted much greater concessions from the British, and they were unimpressed with the level of concessions that the British um, provided. Okay, so it recommended imposing old wartime controls to contain the situation in these areas, and that included imprisonment without trial, non-jury trial, censorship, and house arrests as well. Okay, and this rendered the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms as meaningless, because all of the talk by the British, all of the talk from the British about progressive self-government, um, that was essentially that was essentially destroyed by these Rowlatt Acts, because it showed that the British were willing to oppress and repress and suppress the Indians, okay, to ensure that they were the ones in control. Okay, these Rowlatt Acts essentially showed the Indians that the British were still in control, and they showed no sort of signs of releasing their grip on India thus far.